My name is Ibrahim, but for 12 years I was Choi Sung-min, the personal driver of the most feared and unpredictable man on the planet, Kim Jong-un. While the world saw only carefully orchestrated public appearances, I was in the front seat of every dark secret, every cruel decision, every moment of paranoia that defined the most brutal regime on Earth. For more than a decade, I drove through the frozen streets of Pyongyang carrying a dictator who controlled 25 million lives with an iron fist, witnessing atrocities that would make anyone question their own humanity. But it was during a secret diplomatic trip to Russia in September 2023 that everything changed forever. On a lonely road in Siberia, 200 kilometers from Moscow, something happened that not only destroyed my blind loyalty to the regime, but led me to discover a spiritual truth that Kim Jong-un would do anything to hide from his people. What I witnessed on that trip wasn't just about nuclear negotiations or military alliances. It was about discovering a faith that exists beyond the reach of any dictator, a freedom that no propaganda can destroy. I currently live in Kazan, Russia. Before continuing with my testimony, please write in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know which countries my story is reaching, because what I'm going to share transcends borders, nationalities, and even the highest walls that tyrants build to separate us from the truth. This isn't just my personal story. It's a testimony about how the most powerful spiritual transformation can happen in the most unlikely places, even under the shadow of the most oppressive regime in the modern world. For 12 years, I lived inside the most toxic bubble of power that exists in the modern world. As a driver for the North Korean elite, I wasn't just an employee. I was a keeper of secrets that could start wars or topple governments. I drove Kim Jong-un to public executions, where he smiled while people were killed by anti-aircraft cannon fire. I transported documents about concentration camps, where 200,000 people waste away in subhuman conditions. I took the supreme leader to meetings where he decided which entire families would be sent to forced labor, for crimes like watching South Korean movies or simply questioning state propaganda. My family had served the regime for 4 generations. My great-grandfather fought against the Japanese occupiers during World War II. My grandfather helped build Kim Il-sung's cult of personality. My father was Kim Jong-il's personal bodyguard. I was raised from childhood to be the perfect driver, silent as a shadow, loyal as a dog, invisible as air. I went through extreme military training, constant loyalty checks that included psychological torture and daily brainwashing about the divine supremacy of the Kim family. To me, Kim Jong-un wasn't just a political leader. He was a living god, infallible and all-powerful, and I was privileged to have been chosen to serve him. The propaganda had convinced me that every cruel order I helped execute was necessary to protect our sacred nation from imperialist enemies. I genuinely believed that being in the driver's seat of that armored car was the greatest honor a North Korean could receive. But inside the armored car, during those long silent journeys through North Korea's devastated landscape, I saw who Kim Jong-un really was behind the cameras. I witnessed his psychotic fits of rage when something didn't go as planned, screaming death threats at officials for microscopic infractions. I heard his phone conversations ordering summary executions of people for crimes like owning a Bible or having relatives in South Korea. I saw how he treated his own family, including his wife and children, with paranoid suspicion, calculated cruelty, and absolute contempt. There were 3 things I didn't know yet at that time, 3 devastating revelations that awaited me during our most dangerous and secret trip to Russia. First, the true apocalyptic nuclear plans that Kim Jong-un was secretly negotiating with Putin. Second, the existence of a spiritual faith that completely transcended any state propaganda or personality cult. And third, that my own freedom, something I didn't even know I desired, was much closer than I could ever have imagined possible. In September 2023, I received orders for a mission different from all others I had executed in more than a decade of service. It wouldn't be just another routine diplomatic trip to negotiate coal trade or basic technology. It would be an ultra-secret operation that could literally change the global balance of power and potentially trigger a nuclear world conflict. Kim Jong-un was planning his most crucial and dangerous meeting with Vladimir Putin, and I would be responsible for driving not only the world's most unpredictable dictator, but also a military cargo that could result in the destruction of millions of innocent lives. For 3 weeks before the trip, our security team went through even more intense and paranoid checks than normal, and this in a regime where paranoia was already the default state. Lie detectors administered twice daily, complete and forced isolation from our families without explanation, psychological interrogations that lasted hours, and explicit and detailed threats about tortures that would be applied if any information leaked. What intrigued me most was the extraordinary level of paranoia. Even by extreme North Korean standards, something was fundamentally different. Kim Jong-un was visibly more nervous, more aggressive, more unpredictable than his already habitually erratic behavior. He exploded in fury over trivial matters, constantly changed plans, and showed signs of psychological stress I had never witnessed before. During a security meeting, I saw him threaten to execute a general simply because the man coughed during a presentation. The tension was palpable, and we all knew we were participating in something that could permanently alter world history. On the eve of the trip, I witnessed a phone conversation between Kim Jong-un and his main nuclear generals that chilled me to the bone. They openly discussed the final card that would ensure the Americans and their South Korean dogs would never dare challenge us again. They spoke of revolutionary military technology that would make North Korean missiles completely undetectable and absolutely inevitable. Although I didn't fully understand the technical details at the time, it was clear that I would be transporting plans for a new generation of nuclear weapons that Kim Jong-un intended to trade with Putin for advanced military technology and unconditional geopolitical support. But the nuclear secrets were just the tip of the iceberg of a much more personal and transformative revelation. During that trip, I discovered something about spiritual freedom that would fundamentally question everything I had been taught to believe about purpose, meaning, and loyalty. At 150 kilometers from Moscow, on a lonely road that cut through the frozen vastness of Siberia, our armored convoy of 3 vehicles suffered a catastrophic mechanical breakdown. It was an absolute security nightmare. We were completely vulnerable, exposed on foreign territory, carrying some of the world's most dangerous military secrets without direct communication with Pyongyang. While North Korean technicians worked feverishly to repair the main vehicle, Kim Jong-un was immediately transferred to a backup car with armed escort, and I was assigned to supervise repairs with a local Russian mechanic who had been called in emergency to help. His name was Rashid Volkov, a Tatar Muslim man of about 60 years, with kind eyes that radiated a deep peace I had never seen on a human face, and hands calloused by a lifetime of honest work. While he worked methodically under the car's hood, he began talking to me in broken Russian mixed with some English words, which I could partially understand due to mandatory language training for elite drivers. He spoke naturally about his family, about how he woke up every day before dawn to pray, about the deep and unshakable peace he found in his faith, even while living in a country with such a complex history of religious repression. Initially, I was extremely tense and alert. In North Korea, any conversation about religion, spirituality, or beliefs that weren't the mandatory cult of the Kim family was punished with imprisonment in forced labor camps, systematic torture, or public execution. My first reaction was to try to silence Rashid or change the subject, but something about that man's absolute and natural serenity was magnetic in a way I couldn't explain. He wasn't trying to convert me, wasn't criticizing my government or making propaganda. He was simply living his faith organically and naturally, as if it were the most normal and beautiful thing in the world. During the 40 minutes we waited for the vehicle repair, Rashid told me about Islam in a completely different way from any description I had heard in North Korean anti-religious propaganda. He spoke of voluntary and loving submission to Allah, about how true spiritual freedom comes from choosing to consciously serve the Creator, instead of being forced to worship fallible and corrupted creatures like political leaders. His words planted a deep seed of spiritual unrest in my heart that would grow and develop during the entire trip back home. But it was only when we returned to Pyongyang that I discovered the true cruel and devastating price of blind loyalty to the regime, and how this discovery would forever change my understanding of the value of a human life. A week after our return from Russia, I witnessed something that completely and irreversibly destroyed my faith in the regime and everything I had been taught to value. Kim Jong-un received detailed intelligence reports about dozens of families who had been discovered secretly practicing Christianity in their homes. Instead of simply arresting them discreetly, as was usual protocol, he decided to make a devastating, public example that would be filmed and broadcast to all military units in the country as a brutal lesson about the consequences of religious disloyalty. I drove Kim Jong-un to an isolated military training camp in the industrial outskirts of Pyongyang, where 23 people, including 8 children, were brought in military trucks for public execution by firing squad. These weren't people accused of political treason, international espionage, or crimes against national security. They were simply ordinary North Korean citizens, factory workers, primary school teachers, nurses, who had secretly chosen to believe in something beyond mandatory state propaganda and seek spiritual meaning outside the forced cult of the Kim family. As I watched those entire families being forced to kneel in the frozen mud, with children crying and calling for their parents, a powerful and contrasting memory invaded my mind. The absolute and natural peace on Rashid's face when he spoke about his faith during our encounter on the Siberian road. The contrast was devastating and impossible to ignore. In Russia, Rashid freely practiced his religion, found genuine purpose and transcendent meaning in something infinitely greater than the state. In North Korea, people died brutally simply for seeking the same basic spiritual connection that every human being naturally desires. Kim Jong-un wasn't just controlling bodies through physical intimidation. He was trying to control human souls, destroy the natural search for transcendence, and this was something that transcended any possible political or ideological justification. At that moment, looking at the bodies of those innocent children, I understood that I was serving not a legitimate leader, but a demon who had declared war against the very spiritual nature of humanity. That night, for the first time in 35 years of life, I cried until I had no more tears, not just from sadness, but from an existential rage and disillusionment so deep it left me physically sick for days. I began asking questions I had never dared formulate. What if everything I believed was an elaborate lie? What if Kim Jong-un wasn't a god, but simply a psychopath afraid of losing power? What if there was something greater, truer, infinitely more worthy of devotion and love? 6 months later, in March 2024, we were summoned for another mission to Russia, this time even more secret and dangerous than the previous one. Kim Jong-un was visibly more paranoid, aggressive, and psychologically unstable than I had ever witnessed. Geopolitical tensions had escalated dramatically, and he desperately needed more Russian military support for his increasingly grandiose plans of confrontation with the West. During all the intensive preparation for the trip, I felt as if I was gradually awakening from a dream, or rather, from a nightmare that had lasted 3 decades of my life. During the flight to Moscow, something extraordinary and revealing happened that forever changed my perception of Kim Jong-un's supposed invincibility. He suffered a severe and completely uncontrolled panic attack, something I had never witnessed in more than a decade of driving for him. He began screaming hysterically about invisible enemies and international conspiracies, demanding that the entire aircraft be checked centimeter by centimeter for listening devices or sabotage. For 2 complete hours, I saw the man I considered practically invincible and superhuman reduced to a state of absolute psychotic terror, trembling like a frightened child. It was in that moment of devastating clarity that I understood a fundamental truth that would change my life forever. Kim Jong-un was not a god. He was simply a deeply disturbed man, controlled by paranoid fears, willing to destroy millions of lives to maintain his fragile illusion of absolute power. And if he was only human, fallible and terrified like any other mortal, then his supposedly divine authority over my soul and conscience was a complete and pathetic farce. Before continuing, I need to speak to you who feel that something is blocking your connection with Allah. If your prayers seem unanswered, if you feel strange disturbances at home, or if your health doesn't improve even following treatments, this could be spiritual attack. I went through this. I know how terrifying it is to live under totalitarian control, whether from a political dictator or negative spiritual forces. That's why I recommend the Guide to Ruqya and Spiritual Protection and Habits of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, for healthy living. With authentic Sunnah methods for spiritual protection and healing, symbolic value, because your spiritual protection is priceless. Link in the first comment. In Moscow, during a prolonged security meeting at the hotel, I managed to discreetly escape to look for Rashid. Through contacts in the hotel's maintenance service, I got his phone number and arranged a risky meeting at a small mosque in the city's historic Tatar neighborhood. When I arrived at the location with my heart beating uncontrollably from nervousness and expectation, I found not only Rashid, but an entire community of Russian Muslims living their faith in complete peace, dignity, and freedom. something that seemed impossible for someone raised under total religious repression. Rashid received me as if I were a brother, lost for decades. He didn't ask invasive questions about my delicate political situation or the enormous risks I was taking by being there. He simply invited me to sit on soft carpets, offered hot tea and traditional sweets, and began patiently teaching me about the basic fundamentals of Islam with a gentleness and wisdom that deeply touched me. For the first time in my life, I heard about the true nature of God, not a tyrant thirsty for power and forced worship, but Ar-Rahman, the extremely merciful, who genuinely loves his creatures and only desires to guide them to true peace and spiritual fulfillment. During 3 transformative hours in that simple and welcoming mosque, I learned more about existential purpose, transcendent meaning, and authentic spiritual freedom than in 3 complete decades of intensive state indoctrination. Rashid explained to me with infinite patience about the Shahada, about how true voluntary submission to Allah paradoxically frees the human being from degrading slavery to other fallible human beings. It was exactly the opposite of everything I had experienced in North Korea, where forced submission to the leader created only more fear, psychological control, and spiritual degradation. When the inevitable time came to leave, so as not to arouse suspicion, Rashid held my hands tightly and asked a question that would echo in my mind for weeks. My dear brother, are you ready to choose between serving a man who governs through fear and death, or the Creator who governs through infinite love and mercy? I returned to the hotel in a state of completely devastating emotional and spiritual shock. Kim Jong-un was at that exact moment preparing military agreements that would potentially result in the death of millions of innocent people around the world, and I was directly helping to transport and facilitate these genocidal plans. It was no longer possible for my conscience to pretend I was just following orders or doing my duty. I had become an active and conscious accomplice of a fundamentally evil system that had declared war against humanity itself. That night, completely alone in my hotel room, I did something that was punishable by prolonged torture and public execution in North Korea. I consciously prayed to Allah. I didn't know the correct words in Arabic, didn't know the appropriate rituals or adequate postures, but I instinctively prostrated toward Mecca, as Rashid had taught me, and desperately implored Allah for divine guidance in my impossible situation. For the first time in my life, I felt genuine and transcendent peace, not based on external approval from human authorities or fear of punishment, but in direct connection with something infinitely greater, truer, and more loving than any earthly power. The answer came clearly and unequivocally through an inner certainty I had never experienced. I needed to definitively choose between my temporary physical safety and my eternal spiritual salvation. Remaining in the regime meant continuing to actively participate in atrocities that deeply offended Allah and contributed to the destruction of innocent lives. Escaping meant risking not only my own life, but potentially the lives of family members who still remained in North Korea as involuntary hostages of the system. For 2 agonizing days, I struggled internally with this devastating decision. But then the memory of families executed for simply practicing their faith returned with full force. Innocent children forced to witness their parents' murder. Millions of North Koreans living in total spiritual slavery without even knowing alternatives existed. I decided with absolute conviction that I could no longer be part of this machine of spiritual destruction, regardless of the personal price. On the 3rd day in Moscow, during a routine security inspection at a shopping center, I simply didn't return to the designated meeting point. Instead, I went directly to the mosque where I had met Rashid and declared my desperate intention to defect from the world's most brutal regime. The local Muslim community, demonstrating courage and solidarity that left me completely humbled, immediately activated a clandestine support network for political refugees that had been operating discreetly for decades. Within tense hours, I was hidden in a safe house in the snowy outskirts of Moscow, while lawyers specialized in human rights worked feverishly to process my official political asylum request. During 3 weeks of intense hiding, I lived in constant psychological terror, knowing that elite North Korean agents were searching for me throughout Russia and that Kim Jong-un had personally ordered my capture at any cost, dead or alive. But it was precisely during these 3 weeks of forced isolation that I experienced my true and profound conversion to Islam. Rashid and other dedicated members of the Muslim community visited me daily, patiently teaching me basic prayers, fundamental principles of Islamic faith, and most importantly, how to live concretely according to the practical and spiritual teachings of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Each passing day, I felt thick layers of psychological conditioning and brainwashing being gradually removed from my mind, replaced by a genuine and growing understanding of universal human dignity, transcendent spiritual purpose, and unconditional divine love. But the real test of the depth and authenticity of my newly discovered faith was yet to come, when I discovered the devastating consequences my escape had caused to innocent people. When I finally received official approval for permanent political asylum, I discovered through intelligence sources that my desertion had caused a massive internal scandal within the North Korean regime. Kim Jong-un, in his characteristic paranoia and thirst for revenge, had ordered the summary execution of 3 other elite drivers as a preventive example, and placed all distant members of my family under constant surveillance and regular interrogations. Carrying this devastating guilt almost destroyed me psychologically during the first months, but the Muslim brothers patiently helped me understand that I could only truly honor their suffering by living a life that completely valued the spiritual freedom for which they had paid such a terrible price. In the following 2 years, I worked intensively to permanently establish myself in Kazan, a historic city with a vibrant, welcoming, and deeply rooted Muslim community. I learned Russian fluently through daily classes, got honest work as a mechanic, ironically the same noble profession as Rashid, and completely integrated into the spiritual and social life of the local mosque. But most importantly, I began actively working with international human rights organizations to meticulously document the specific atrocities I had witnessed during my years serving the regime directly. My detailed testimony helped prosecute legal cases against high-ranking North Korean officials in international human rights courts, and provided crucial technical evidence about the advanced nuclear weapons program I had personally helped transport. I gradually discovered that my risky escape hadn't been just about personal salvation. Allah, in His infinite wisdom, had strategically positioned me to be a powerful voice for the oppressed who still suffer under Kim Jong-un's brutal regime, unable to escape or even know that alternatives existed. Today, when I perform my 5 daily obligatory prayers, I pray not only for my own continued spiritual guidance, but fervently for the 25 million North Koreans who still live without knowing the fundamental freedom that Allah graciously offers to all His creatures. I pray intensely that one day they too may experience the transcendent peace that comes from voluntarily submitting to the loving Creator, instead of being forced through terror to worship fallible, corrupted, and fundamentally evil creatures. My extraordinary journey from dictator's driver to free Muslim taught me the most fundamental truth of existence. No earthly power, however brutal or totalitarian, can truly imprison a soul that genuinely belongs to Allah. Kim Jong-un can control bodies through violence, can manipulate minds through intensive propaganda, can even take physical lives, but he can never touch or destroy the sacred and eternal connection between a sincere believer and his merciful Creator. Today, when I look back retrospectively at my journey, I clearly see that Allah used even my darkest and most painful years serving a fundamentally evil regime to gradually prepare me for something infinitely greater and more significant. Every moment of conscious suffering, every witness of brutal injustice, every silent questioning was gradually leading me to this moment of public testimony and clarified spiritual purpose. For those who have been genuinely touched by this story and would like to concretely support the work I do on this channel, I would be deeply grateful for any super thanks you could generously offer. Each financial contribution goes directly and entirely to taking this message further. Please share this video widely in your WhatsApp groups, your personal social networks, with close friends and dear family members. Maybe someone you know urgently needs to hear that radical transformation is possible, that true freedom exists and is available, and that it's never too late to consciously choose truth over lies, light over darkness, love over fear. May Allah abundantly bless all of you, regardless of where you currently are in your personal spiritual journeys. Allahu Alam, Allah knows best and He guides whom He wills to the straight path.